Hello everybody and welcome to another ATC Maths and Science tutorial video. Today we'll be dealing with the introduction to galvanic cells. So a galvanic cell is one where a chemical reaction, more specifically a redox reaction, is used to generate an electric current. So the energy conversion that occurs in this galvanic cell is one of chemical energy to electrical energy. Right? Now, before we discuss what an anode is, what a cathode is, and exactly what reaction is taking place in here, let's discuss what a galvanic cell does. So the properties of a galvanic cell is, number one, it converts chemical energy to electrical energy. Number two, this cell must, or the reaction that takes place here, which we know is a redox reaction. For a galvanic cell, this reaction is an exothermic reaction. And lastly, the reaction that takes place here is spontaneous. Now, a classic example of a galvanic cell in real life is a battery. And we understand that in a battery, we just plug a battery into maybe a remote control or your cell phone. And as long as that battery is fully charged, immediately, instantaneously, spontaneously, the reaction takes place. But when we use our cell phones, for instance, for an extended period of time, you will notice that the phone itself gets hot. And that's because of the exothermic reaction that's occurring in the battery itself, right? So this is what happens in a galvanic cell. Now, how does a galvanic cell work? So a galvanic cell, let's firstly discuss what it consists of so that we can better understand how it works. So a galvanic cell has two electrodes, one known as the anode and the other known as the cathode. And when it comes to dealing with questions involving the galvanic cell, one of the most fundamental concepts that we have to deal with, it's the major concept. If we actually know how to answer this question, it solves most of the problem for us, or most of the questions, is actually to decide which electrode is the anode and which electrode is the cathode. Now, as we can see as indicated on the diagram, we can see that oxidation occurs at the anode and reduction occurs at the cathode. So how do we determine whether zinc is where oxidation occurs and copper was where reduction occurs, the oxidation and reduction reactions? There's three ways for us to determine this. And which method out of the three we will use depends on the information given to us. So we must note that there are three ways to determine anode or cathode. Now, method number one is to use the data sheet. So we will use what we call table 4B of the table of half reactions, which is in our data sheet, which is given to us, right? So I'll put up an example of that now. So this would be table 4B from our data sheet, which is the standard reduction potentials. Now, how do we use this table to determine anode or cathode? We must remember that when we're we'll be looking for, let's say we were dealing with the same zinc and copper. So we would use this table and try to see which of those two substances are located higher or lower on the table. For instance, we can see here zinc at this point, minus 0.76. And as we scroll further down, we will come across several coppers, right? And we want to know, I mean, there's one reaction, two reactions, three reactions with copper. Which one is the one we're looking at? Well, the diagram here tells us which one we're dealing with. It's Cu, solid, and in the aqueous solution here, CuSO4, that's actually Cu2+. So in our reaction, the chemical reaction we see in the table, we've got to have a Cu on one side of the equation and a Cu2+ on the other. So if we look at it, Cu2+, Cu+, it's not this one. Cu2 plus Cu, it's going to be this 0.34. But we've identified the correct reaction, but what we're really interested in is which reaction is higher than the other on the table. So as we can see, zinc is higher than copper. Therefore, we can say that zinc will be oxidized and copper will be reduced. So in terms of our theory, when we're using table 4b, we can say substance or the reaction higher on table is oxidized. Therefore, the anode, because oxidation occurs at the anode. So naturally, the substance lower on the table would be reduced and therefore cathode. So substance or the reaction lower on table, reduced. Therefore, that would make that the cathode. But as I said, there's three ways to figure out whether we're looking at the anode or the cathode, which substance is being oxidized and which substance is being reduced. Method number one is only used when we are given exactly what both these metals are. We're told one is zinc and we're told one is copper. So we know immediately, we go to table 4b and we can deal with it. We can figure out higher or lower on the table, oxidized, reduced, anode, cathode. However, what happens if one of these metals is not given to us as zinc? Let's say they just say to us in the question, that's metal X. So if it's given to us as metal X, we can't use the table. I mean, well, what is X? It could be anything. So we must be given further information. And the information that we will be given is in one of two parts. Number one, we will be given the observations. Now, what are these observations? Let us remember that this is an actual experiment. Therefore, if this was occurring in reality, if we had to physically set up the system, we would expect to see some physical changes occurring. And what we will notice at the anode, that the metal electrode there, it's sort of, I'm using the word dissolves, though that is, I would say, the scientifically incorrect term, but it's the easiest one for us to imagine what's going on. We would see that metal zinc sort of dissolve into the liquid. So the observation there is that the anode will lose mass, whereas the cathode, on the other hand, this aqueous copper, this Cu2+, which is going to be gaining electrons, will then become Cu solid. So this Cu2+ in the aqueous solution will plate itself onto the copper electrode, and so it will get thicker and thicker. and we will physically observe that the cathode gains mass. So when we are not given exactly what element or compound the electrodes are, we must be given information to tell us in the description, in the question itself, which electrode is losing and which electrode is gaining mass. But let's say we're not given that. We're not even given that. Then we must be given a third bit of information. We must be told which electrode is positive and negative. If you think about a battery, batteries have that. Positive electrodes, negative electrodes. We see it labeled on a battery, right? So we must note that the anode is the negative electrode, and the cathode would be the positive electrode. And once we have decided, based on the 3 bits of given information, which electrode between the two happens to be anode and cathode, as I said, that's half the problem solved. So in the next video, we will continue with dealing with what are the other components in here, the salt bridge, and exactly how this galvanic cell works, how exactly these reactions take place. What is the cell notation all about?